Welcome, everyone. I thank you for joining our webinar from the Center on Global Energy Policies Women in Energy program. We're very excited about today's event, exploring the social aspects in ESG sustainability investing. We have a great lineup today. We have people who've given this subject some thought in a professional context. We have someone from a venture fund, someone from a private equity fund, someone who served on energy boards and has a long experience in the energy industry, and one of our very own professors from Columbia Business School. But I do want to encourage, I see we have a wide audience today, and I want to encourage you to make yourselves to come to our website, and me in particular, you can find me on LinkedIn. I'm Amy Jaffe. I am the co-chair of the steering committee for this Women in Energy program. We are looking for many diverse speakers that are active in the subject of energy finance and social priorities, including social justice. So please reach out. We're looking to really expand the network in the next year. Without further ado, I'm going to tell you a little bit about the program. We are based at Columbia University, but include a network of several universities across the United States, including MIT, Tufts University, New York University, the New School in New York, and Rutgers University. Again, we're looking to broaden our network, so maybe move outside of our geography now that Zoom has become a norm. We don't have to ask people to fly from other parts of the country for some of our programs, so all good, and we're also expanding internationally. And we are looking to help expand knowledge on how to make a more diverse leadership across the energy sector writ large. So that's in traditional energy, clean energy, energy finance, energy activism, and we hope to bring together people with various points of view on what are the best ways to achieve that. We also have a network for our students at the universities I mentioned to help with career counseling and other kinds of skills that are needed in the marketplace. And we are expanding our programs for mid-level and senior women in the industry, having had a lot of several workshops and seminars on various topics, including the role of a diverse board of directors. So I welcome you all and look forward to today's discussion. I'm going to turn the microphone over to Maria, and she will introduce herself and then begin our panel. Maria, go ahead.
Thank you, Amy, and good morning, everyone, and welcome. I am Maria Gillescu. I am the other co-chair with Amy of the Women in Energy program at Columbia University, and I am thrilled to be moderating the discussion today. As Amy said, the topic is energy and the S in ESG investing. And let me just quickly say that this event is being webcast live, and the full video will be available online in the coming days. And then for those of you joining us via Zoom, you can submit a question for the panelists at any time by clicking on the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. We hope today's discussion will be a candid conversation about the progress or lack thereof of energy companies on the diversity front. And when we talk about the energy sector, we think of it broadly as it touches many aspects of the global economy. And when we talk about diversity, we also think of it broadly as gender, ethnic, racial, and other dimensions. As Amy mentioned, in our past work, the Women in Energy program has been focused on helping attract, retain, and promote more women and diverse candidates in the energy sector. And we have focused on diversity on boards, diversity in the C-suite. Today, we're going to dig a little bit deeper into some of the positive changes that ESG investing is bringing into the energy world, including a more active push from large institutional investors and asset owners. So without further ado, let me allow the panelists to introduce themselves one by one, and I will ask you to turn your camera on and share with us your background, and also each of your specific angles into the diversity discussion. So let me start, I'll start clockwise on my screen with Ruth. Ruth is the chairman of the board of Gevo Inc. She's an operating partner with Triton Energy Partners and board member of DMC Global Inc. And Ruth, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Maria. Well, as Maria said, I'm the chairman of Gevo Inc. That is an alternative energy producer. We're publicly traded, and we focus on low carbon, sustainable fuels. I'm also on the board of DMC Global, which is a little bit more of a traditional company that is a niche manufacturer that serves the upstream oil and gas and chemical industries. I'm also an operating partner at Triton Energy Partners, where we focus on both chemicals and energy in general, but from an alternative perspective. I've been very lucky, in a sense, to be involved in this industry from a lot of different perspectives. I really started out in banking, and I was an investment banker focused on the industry. I've also been involved with private equity. I was a CFO of several publicly traded chemical companies in Houston. And I've been on the board, and I had to actually count them. I've been on the board, besides the ones I'm on now, previously 5 different energy and chemical companies. So I think I've sort of experienced it from a lot of different angles, and I'm very pleased to be here today.
Thank you, Ruth. Next is Cara Helander, who is Managing Director and Chief Diversity Officer for Carlyle. Cara?
Thank you. Thank you, Maria. It's great to be here. And so in my role as Chief Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Officer at Carlyle, I am responsible for advancing diversity, equity, and inclusion at Carlyle itself, but also throughout our portfolio company. And that's a pretty exciting remit for me because Carlyle has investments in over 250 companies around the world, and in total employs through those companies nearly 1 million people. So it's exciting to think about having that kind of impact across the globe. The Carlyle commitment around this comes from a very rigorous and sort of business-oriented perspective, as well as a social perspective. One of the things that I often like to cite is the fact that we've done research on our own portfolio. And we looked at the performance of our portfolio companies that have a diverse board of directors versus those that do not have a diverse board of directors. And one of the things that we've found is that those companies with a diverse board have average annual earnings growth that's 12% higher. So we really see this as a value creation tool for us. As you can hear in my love of some of that data and that business commercial orientation is that I come at this from a very pragmatic and sort of research-driven perspective. And that's because my background, I'm educated in business, MBA from Wharton, was a strategy consultant, led corporate social responsibility for Barclays Global Investors. And prior to coming to Carlyle, I was at BlackRock leading diversity and strategic philanthropy. And I also co-founded an organization called the Science of Diversity and Inclusion Initiative. And the focus of that organization is to really bring together leading behavioral scientists and leading companies to identify and understand, one, how can we take some of the insights from behavioral science and put it in the hands of people and companies that are trying to make change, but also how can we use insights from behavioral science to give us even more tools to drive change.
Fascinating. Thank you so much. Next is Vera Maxwell. Vera is a partner at Ajax Investment Strategies and the Director of Energy Innovation. Vera?
Hi, everyone. Thanks for having me. As Maria said, I'm a partner at Ajax Strategies. We're a climate-focused venture fund. We invest across kind of all of the main emissions drivers, so power, transportation, industrials, and ag in the venture space. So slightly different from some of the other panelists. We typically invest in companies that have early revenue, but are certainly not yet profitable. We also care deeply about diversity, and two of the three of the partners at Ajax are women, and it's something we focus on tremendously when looking at our investment pipeline. So I'm both proud and unhappy to say that 40% of our CEOs are diverse, but I feel like given the focus of the firm, that number should be significantly higher. That's the product of many years and a lot of effort. And I'm really, interested in some of the things that Cara laid out around the data. We also push incredibly hard on diversity on our boards. And so even though I just cited 40% of our CEOs are diverse, we actually have 80% of our boards are diverse beyond just the diversity that Ajax contributes. So we like to look beyond ourselves for that. And a big part of our focus is cultivating a large group of really accomplished operators, investors that can sit in independent director seats on our boards. Those seats tend to come with our investments and often just provide tremendous value to these early stage companies. So we're really focused on bringing people in with interesting backgrounds with a lot to contribute. And certainly, though my N is smaller than Carlisle's, can also completely reinforce that we do track things like revenue growth, and how that correlates to diversity. And we certainly see evidence of that across our portfolio as well. So anyways, I'm excited to be here and learn more.
Thank you very much. Our next speaker is Professor Rita McGrath from Columbia University's Business School. Rita?
Hi, a pleasure to be here. Thank you for inviting me, everyone. So my research really is at the intersection of strategy and innovation. And my most recent book has to do with strategic inflection points. And one of the fascinating things about inflection points, which are big changes, things like the energy transition, right? Things that are going to fundamentally change the business model now and going forward. And diverse teams do a lot better at picking up the weak signals of big changes than teams that are relatively homogenous. And I think that's the angle I'll focus on here, which is, if you've just got one perspective and one way of looking at things, chances are there are things going on in the environment you're just not going to pick up. The other big consideration for the inclusion of diversity in the agenda is that it tends to correlate with factors such as psychological safety, which means people are much more willing to bring forth uncomfortable or discomforting information. So let me give an example, which I think is kind of interesting. Some years back, I was actually at the Columbia Media Forum, and there was a small team there giving a pitch about this new venture they were launching. And the new venture was going to take all the payphones in the city of New York and replace them with these super cool internet kiosks. The project was called Link NYC. You can still see it's out there. They're out there today. And I happened to get into conversation with this team, and they were all cookie cutter, right? They were all Ivy League schools, engineering or science grads, all the top drawer schools in New York, but similar backgrounds, similar socioeconomic status, So I remember asking the team, I said, so how are people going to use these kiosks, right? So the kiosks were internet access, paid for by advertising, so the city didn't have to pay for it. And you would be able to charge your phone and look up things. And I said to them, well, how are people going to use these kiosks? They said, oh, it's going to be amazing. They're going to use them to find out like the address of the local artisanal cheese shop and, what time the farmer's market opens. In other words, they were going to use these kiosks, people in the city of New York, the way this design team was going to use these kiosks. And so they rolled this out across the city of New York. And within about 24 hours, we had homeless people setting up encampments and watching YouTube all day long. We had people watching porn in like tourist areas, people like lingering by these things and rocking out to music. In other words, the use case was a little different than the design team had projected. And here's my hypothesis. Had they had someone on that design team who actually knows something about what goes on the streets of the city of New York, you would have had a completely different kind of design consideration. As it turns out, they had to take down the internet functionality. Local shopkeepers regard these things in many cases as kind of an attractive nuisance. And it just didn't realize the ambition that they had laid out when they were designing it. And to me, that's just a like microcosm of the risks that you can run in a changing world when you don't have diverse perspectives.
Fantastic example. Thank you, Rita. And let me bring back Amy into the conversation. You all know Amy, but other than her involvement with the Columbia University Energy Center, she's also a research professor and managing director of the Climate Policy Lab at the Fletcher School at Tufts University.
Well, today, I think I'm going to speak as a former advisor to the UC Regents pension and endowment funds on ESG. Very challenging challenge for that pension fund, which is very large, to pivot to integrate ESG across its entire investment platform. And one of the things we found as we were exploring how to do that was that the kind of indexes or strategies that people offer to a large pension funds, $130 billion pension fund, an endowment, in the public equity space, so stock market indexes and so forth, really doesn't move the needle. Where you really need to drill down was in areas like our real assets investing and our co-investing, needing to understand, because those things are harder to screen, understanding that the fixed income market can have a sudden tumble if you're not focused on an ESG issue and it flares up in the news, and then looking broadly across other kinds of investment, real estate and other kinds of investment where increasingly social dimensions are very telltale, whether something is going to succeed or not succeed. So just a statistic or two, and then I'm going to turn it over to the rest of our panel. In 2020, 2% of venture capital spending went to firms that have a woman CEO. I mean, that's a pretty shocking statistic. That probably all of them were people that Vera funded. I don't know. Anyway, point is, it's a very small statistic, and it's a challenge. I mean, to give you another example, Maria and I met with the director for ESG for a very large regional pension fund, and we spent a lot of the conversation talking about, we had this new movement towards gender lens investing, and he explained to us that there's no metrics on which he could pivot his pension fund to consider those kind of social issues when investing. So really big challenge, and a challenge in how the whole universe functions. How many women are on the team for investing in at the asset allocation world? How many women are serial entrepreneurs and have had that opportunity, because at a rate of 2% of funding, it's hard for women to accumulate 5 different businesses over time. And also the academic research shows that women who are interviewed by VC are often asked what are their concerns about whether their venture might not succeed, whereas men are asked what is their plan for growth. And so you have these sort of unconscious concerns that come into the questioning that can color an outcome. And then final point, a statistical, there was a 2017 evidence-based study, that means working with real data from the investment community, and it found a link between the higher number of women on the board or in leadership in an energy company or other big industrial sectors and environmental performance and concern about environment and safety. So, a critical thing to try to get this right. And I think one of the things we should discuss on the panel today is the NASDAQ's proposed rule about having requirements for company boards to be listed on NASDAQ.
Wish we had 5 hours for this panel and not 1.5, but just to set the stage, I wanted to start the discussion with the rising importance of social considerations in the corporate world. And so, we all know that diversity, equity, and inclusion considerations have been front and center for the last year, 18 months. We also know that the business case is now very well understood, as Rita articulated. So how come real progress on S is still so slow? And I want to go back to you, Rita, and putting your strategic inflection point framework or hat on, why is it still so hard for women and people of color to have a real voice?
Well, I think it comes down to how human beings connect to others in a social setting. We have a very well understood bias toward understanding and relating to people that we know. We tend to find people that are similar to us to be more trustworthy, to be more relatable, to be more likable. And it just takes a long time to break through that. So I think that's one. I think a second one is many of the social networks that business people belong to did not have diverse people as part of them. And I think, it takes work, I think, is really the bottom line, which is you have to make an effort. I mean, you have to want to do it. I mean, it has to go beyond this is a good thing to do, or this is the right thing to do. And it comes down to, okay, it's 8:30 in the morning. I have an hour to spend on something that's discretionary, and the rest of my day is totally taken up with other things. Am I going to spend that hour on the diversity agenda, or am I going to spend it on something else? And, a lot of times the decision is spend it on something else. So it has to be a priority, it has to be on the agenda. People have to be willing to do the work. And if you're not willing to do that, it's just kind of situation as usual. And so I'll recall something that my late colleague Kathy Phillips researched. And she, the problem with the real world, right, is you never know whether the outcome was actually caused by what we think it was. Like you can be horrendously stupid and a bad manager and just have a toxic workplace, and things work out because you happen to be in the right place at the right time. You got lucky. Or you can be, the best designed, best managed team in the world, and you're a travel business in December of 2019. And I'm sorry, nothing is going to help you under those circumstances. But in Kathy's research, she designed a creative problem-solving task where she actually knew what the right answer was. And in a laboratory, you can do that, right? And she had diverse teams do this creative problem-solving task, and homogenous teams do this creative problem-solving task. And what she found was the homogenous teams felt great about what they had done, right? We all got together, we all spoke the same language, it was phenomenal, we got right down to business, we finished our task quickly, and it was like, hey, whoa, way to go, dude, right? So they felt great. The diverse teams felt terrible. It was so much work. I had to explain myself. I didn't know where that person was coming from. We had completely different ideas about how we should go about doing it. And so they felt terrible. And it took longer, it was much more effort. But the homogenous teams did far worse on the creative problem solving task than the diverse teams. And so here's the interesting, to me, sort of extrapolation of this. And if you look at the leadership of many of our organizations and institutions, like across the world, are they diverse or are they homogenous? And if they are homogenous, and Kathy's research holds, what that suggests is we are leaving a mountain of performance on the floor because they feel great about what they're doing, but the performance is not going to be there.
Speaking of homogeneous groups, let's zoom into the energy sector. And maybe a good way to think about it is to break it up into old energy and new energy. And I wanted to get Ruth's perspective as the chairperson of a clean tech company. If you can address the new energy side of the equation.
Sure. Well, I think it's useful maybe just to set the scene and to say something that perhaps we really all know already, which is that the traditional energy sector these days has a reputational issue. It's it's viewed as low growth, it's viewed as cyclical commodity, and most of all, kind of the more recent issue is that it really hasn't been in the forefront of tackling climate change. And all of those things are just the opposite, of course, for alternative energy companies. What's really interesting about GEVO in particular, the one I'm most familiar with is, everybody who works there is very excited about being able to work there because it's almost, mission driven. Yes, I mean, we're a company, we're publicly traded, we have shareholders, all of that. But when you come to work in the morning, or, if you're on the board and you're going through the 10Q and, all of that, it all feels so much better because you really do feel like you're contributing to something very, very important. The other thing is, of course, it's very fast paced. It's very fast growth. It has its ups and downs. It's not easy. There are a lot of challenges. However, there's a satisfaction level that I think, at least in recent years, I think the traditional energy companies has really had to struggle with. It's not just minorities. All of these companies report having trouble hiring in general. And they have a very aging workforce. So it's definitely a challenge.
And I'd love for Amy to chime in here with her perspective, because I don't think anybody knows the incumbents, the traditional oil companies, better than Amy. And I'd love to get your perspective on the current state of affairs in the traditional old energy world, Amy.
Rita mentioned the work of Kathy Phillips, and it's really important work. One of the findings of her study was that people who have heterogeneous thinking, for whatever reason, they come from the same socioeconomic background or the same ethnic background or the same educational background, tend to feel their solutions are very successful. Whereas when you have a diverse team trying to hammer out solutions, they actually have a higher percentage chance of coming up with the right answer. She used to do these experimental group studies. They have a much higher chance of coming out with a better solution. But it's a very uncomfortable process. People don't necessarily agree. There's a lot of exchange of ideas. People have differing perspectives that has to be navigated through leadership or through inclusive discussion. And that's harder. And, Kathy was at a meeting that we had with CEOs from the traditional energy industry and board members from the traditional energy industry. And people were talking about the programs they had on bias training and so forth. And Kathy made an important point, which is one I think that everybody struggles with, which is that if you bring someone of a diverse background, especially someone from an underrepresented group into a venture, and you haven't changed your culture, then you haven't created a system in which that new person or persons can be successful. And this cultural change, I think, is the one that as a nation we're struggling with, which you can see in the headlines. But I think in the energy industry specifically, and especially in certain segments of the traditional industry, it's particularly difficult because you have a lot of petroleum engineering programs that are located at specific schools. Those programs attract a lot of white male students, or even if they attract diverse students, quite honestly, the industry is comfortable hiring people that were like in the same fraternity or have similar social markers, and then you get this problem in the industry, which I think the industry suffers from, and really needs to change, which is if I have 5 or 10 heterogeneous engineers, scientists, and business people making a decision, as Rita showed in her outstanding example about the internet booths, will you come up with the right answer? And I can say, and it's doubly true for people with very diverse backgrounds. I mean, the energy industry is very international on the traditional side, and so you do get a lot of diversity coming in from international partners. But I can tell you, as a woman who grew up at the edges of that industry professionally, it was not an easy lift when I started my career in that industry. And, I have, I think I'm on NPR one time. I mean, I have stories of going to industry gatherings, important industry gatherings, as a writer for important publications like the Wall Street Journal and Petroleum Intelligence Weekly, which at the time was the premier and maybe one of the very few specialized consulting letters. And I would go to a function, and the only other women there were women who were paid to be there for social reasons. And it was challenging, and of course the industry has changed a lot since then, but the cultural way that people behave, or if people are going out to play golf together in an outing and so forth, I mean, even those kinds of things that are very bonding in the industry have to be done in a more inclusive cultural way. And I think that's still a difficulty.
That's for sure, Amy. Culture change is different, but let's talk about maybe concrete steps that we could tackle these challenges. And I want to bring Cara into the conversation because her company actually recently had a very interesting announcement. I wanted Cara, I wanted you to talk about your own company, Carlyle, which is a public company, and your recent changes in terms of executive compensation, linking that to a diversity score. So in the context of, you don't change what you don't measure. Talk about some of the cultural changes that come from some of these initiatives, and what else are you doing internally that you have found impactful?
Yeah, so I want to echo what Amy said about the importance of, you have to work on the culture, and what are you rewarding, what are you fostering in the culture, so that you are able, once you have those diverse teams, to bring out the best in each of those individuals and collectively. And so we focus a lot on that. And, you mentioned the compensation is absolutely tied to executive, or progress is tied to executive compensation in terms of diversity, equity, inclusion. We're also, though, asking each one of our employees in the firm to set their own objective around diversity, equity, and inclusion. We made that a formal part of our process this year, because how someone experiences the workplace is impacted by everyone they're interacting with. And so we want people to be intentional and thoughtful and to know that we value it. So we have, as you know, we do link executive comp. It's one of the 5 areas that our board has set to influence our CEO's bonus. But we've also made that clear for all of the folks in the organization. Now, along with that, you've got to not just compensation, but reward it and signal its importance in other ways. You know, one of the things that we've done is now for anyone who's being nominated for promotion to managing director at Carlyle, they go through a 360-degree review. And one of the core elements they're assessed on is inclusive leadership and management. Again, so what we're signaling there is that we value this. This is what we consider to be a characteristic of an effective modern leader. You know, there's other ways that we're educating our folks. We do have a whole initiative that we call Better Decisions, which is around helping people understand how bias, unconscious bias, can enter into decision making, but more importantly, what are some of the things that as individuals we can do in both big decisions and in small decisions to take action. I think the final thing that, you know, you have to be intentional. You have to think about this in all of the decisions that you're making, not just who you're hiring, who you're promoting, but who are you giving some key assignments to. All of those things come together to create the conditions for you to really maximize the performance you're getting out of every person in your organization. So it's not easy. It's not there's no one silver bullet in terms of what will work. It is really that focus on intention. There's one other thing I will mention that I was super excited about, and I think it's a signal of, you know, greater, as you said, recognition of the business case. But we recently announced a line of credit for our U.S. private equity groups, and it's a $4.1 billion line of credit, but with our cost of capital tied to making progress against our goal of having 30% diverse directors on the boards of our portfolio companies. So as we hit milestones towards that 30%, our cost of borrowing goes down. And so that's, you know, I think a signal that the broader business community is beginning to value progress around this, which we have a long way to go, but it takes some I think that's, I think that's a positive sign.
That's a very interesting tidbit indeed. And I wanted to follow up on folks setting their own diversity, equity, and inclusion goals. How do you benchmark that? Or what is the range, the scale? What are the metrics? What are the KPIs there? And then as a follow-up to that, Cara, we talked in the pre-call about what you're specifically doing in your energy private equity portfolios and also on the infrastructure side when it comes to diversity. Can you talk a little bit more specifically about those pockets of capital for our discussion? Thank you.
Sure. Let me start first by, you know, we have metrics that we track for each part of our business that look at diversity. What's the progress around hiring, which is part of it, and representation. But then we also look at development and how are they developing their people, and we have metrics around that. And then we have metrics around inclusive environment. And so that's drawing on feedback from employee surveys, but it's also measuring things like what is the participation rate in certain key educational and action sort of steps that people are taking. On the individual level, what we've done is given all of our folks, you know, basically in essence like a tool to help them to think about their own sphere of influence. And then what are some of the steps that concrete steps that they can take within their sphere of influence to contribute to an inclusive culture. And that's something that we ask them to include in their formal objectives. So that's a little bit about how we're measuring it. In terms of some of our energy groups, I can tell you that our international energy group has set some expectations around the companies in the portfolio, around establishing a business case for diversity that's specific to that organization, having a policy in place. I mean, these may seem like sort of small steps, but it's important about getting some of those groups to start thinking about it and being intentional about it. And they're also working to diversify the boards of those organizations, because we do know that there's power in that, not only in performance, but when you have a more diverse board, you tend to then have more focus, I think, as Amy or Rita may have said, around these issues of ESG.
Amy, would you like to chime in here for a quick
Yes,
comment?
let me chime in. So under a grant from the Sloan Foundation, so shout out to Sloan, I have been working on the issue of public finance and diversity, inclusion, and fairness. And as part of that program, I've been interviewing, people like Vera and others who are angel investors or early stage investing companies, and also VC. And I think one of the most interesting things that there's a leader of a very successful investment firm from the Midwest. And so I was interested to speak with them because they're also geographically diverse. So not on the West Coast or the East Coast, and to try to understand what they were doing. And they told me something that I thought was very important. And it's very important because it's embedded in a Senate. I don't know what the Senate's calling that bill, but like an industrial policy bill that we can't say industrial policy apparently in the United States, but something that would help key industries. And it's a practice that I've seen from the university side that can be very constructive. So one of the excuses you'll hear people say is, oh, we couldn't find anyone. And that's not usually true. And I think one of the other panelists can speak to how to set up recruiting firms for positions for leadership in a way that you get a diverse slate of candidates, because part of the problem sometimes is the narrow network of the recruiting firms. But beyond the recruiting firms, if you're especially in venture finance, but I think even more broadly in energy investing, especially in technology, this firm that was so successful and had, I think, over 50% of the leadership of their firms, somebody put in the chat, and I agree with this, white women are making more progress in energy. Witness our panel. We're all very successful leaders in the field. But it's harder to identify visible underrepresented minorities, and that goes across different groups, and even the LGBT community. So one of the things that this firm did is they literally went around to different universities looking for diverse scientists and engineers and business students and others who were working on interesting inventions or ventures from the university, which is a lot of the sort of Silicon Valley world, begins at Stanford and then coagulates together with VC finance. So this firm made a solid commitment to go around university world and look for diverse younger people who are starting out or faculty that were not necessarily visible, and they sought it out. And they had an unbelievably high track record, not only in having diverse leaders in startups, but in their return was much higher than the industry average. So I mentioned that for those who are listening to this webinar, because that is a lot of what venture groups do. And at the UC, we even had an allocation at the UC for funding speculative or more speculative, I guess the CIO wouldn't like me using that word, early stage technologies, specifically at the UC and our national labs. So in that respect, if you're listening, someone from the UC, going back around with that venture fund and looking specifically at diversity of the skills and leadership that we would have had in within the system would have been a really important way to do it. And I think that could be true for a lot of different firms that are already working with labs and university researchers and other kinds of entities that do indeed have much more diversity because they have made that an important value.
Speaking of venture, I wanted to bring Vera into the conversation. When Amy and I did our work for the paper that we published as part of the Women in Energy programming this year, we were actually struck by the fact that venture capital was so massively underrepresented in terms of women and people of color. So it was across the board. It was in startups, in terms of business entrepreneurs. It was also in terms of venture capital allocators. And the numbers that Amy quoted earlier, less than 2% of venture funding went to women. And that was last year in 2020. Less than 2% went to people of color. And I'm not saying that the other asset classes are doing much better. They're still in the single digits, but they're in the high single digits as opposed to very low single digits. So question to you, Vera, what is the opportunity to accelerate change, maybe, above and beyond what a handful of firms like yours are doing?
Yeah, it's a great question. It's a hard question. I think that what you just laid out is exactly the kind of self-fulfilling prophecy that drives so much in venture, right? Is, as everyone has identified, people are very comfortable with pattern matching within their own experience. And that is a really challenging cycle to break. And the reality is, and I actually haven't seen these numbers, I'm saying this based completely on my own anecdotal evidence, I think more diverse venture firms tend to support significantly more diverse management teams because it's a two-way street. When we're trying to make an investment, the counterparty also has to want our capital. And so, there's the side of this of what type of partner are people looking for, both from a investor standpoint and an entrepreneur standpoint. And I think that, there are relatively few diverse entrepreneurs, and they are often very excited to work with diverse investment teams. So I think you see it as a virtuous cycle on one side and a very negative cycle on the other side. In my mind, I mean, the way to kind of break this are some of the things that have already been identified. So I don't have anything groundbreaking to say here, but bringing diversity onto the boards is so important at these companies, because all of the questions, I mean, we've already talked about measuring this stuff, and way more investors need to be asking the hard questions, both when they're in diligence, but also when a company becomes a portfolio company. All of our companies have to fill in a quarterly report that's all of their financials, but we're also asking things about who'd you hire? What's the diversity of your team? How has that changed since last quarter? And these aren't, I mean, I'm sure there are companies that find the questions modestly annoying, but we tell people before we invest that we care about these things just the same way we care about climate impact, and that we're going to keep track of it. And I will say, I think asking the questions prompts a lot more self-reflection. amongst the management teams and asking the questions repeatedly. Well, maybe slightly annoying. You know, and this has already been said, I think so much of this is about stepping back and being deliberate. And so much of venture is just a rush. You know, everyone's in a hurry. The company is burning cash. They need to solve problems today. And there was a question in the chat around, you know, emphasis on hiring diversity, even if there's going to have to be training involved versus, you know, just kind of making the easy hire. And I think what you see is when teams are more deliberate, they can take a slightly longer term view and not be in such a rush. And the longer term view translates to all kinds of facets across their business. I mean, that's hiring, but that's many other business decisions. And I think those types of management teams tend to be more successful overall across all of the facets we care about. So I guess I'm not particularly answering your question, but I would say is, I do think there's a huge amount of responsibility that should be put in the laps of both investors like the venture firms, but also the LP community, because all of this kind of rolls downhill. If LPs are telling their GPs to get more diverse and get a more diverse portfolio and ask these questions, it all does roll through the system, but it's taking too long. I mean, there's just no, you guys have cited the numbers, it's taking too long. And we need to shift into a much, I would say, kind of a wider impact virtuous cycle, which I think comes from the boards, it comes from the LPs, it comes from the venture firms, and it also comes from successful repeat entrepreneurs who are the types of entrepreneurs that can pick and choose what type of capital they take in. Because I think it will send a huge signal to the market the more those types of folks also indicate that they care about it from an investor standpoint, from a board standpoint, from a hiring standpoint.
Excellent. I see questions starting to trickle into the Q&A chat box, and I encourage you to ask questions as we're going to be taking questions from the audience in just a few minutes. But I wanted to ask a question to the broader panel. It's a controversial topic, and people feel very differently about it. It's the role of policymaking in trying to close the gender gap and the other gaps that we have around the lack of diversity. And, you know, I'm not just talking about what California did in terms of mandating a certain number of women on boards, which was great, by the way, and the effect of that policy has been tremendous and has been really fast to get implemented, but more also from the standpoint of thinking about childcare or elderly care in the context of allowing women to participate and rise to the top in their various lines of work. So curious for anybody's perspective as to whether there's a role for policymaking in accelerating some of these changes, and what would be palatable in today's environment. Any takers?
Are you talking about government policy,
Yes.
basically, mandating? I think that I think it's a two-edged sword, frankly. I mean, I think there would be a negative reaction among a lot of the businesses because I think they feel that they can actually address the issues in the way that works for their particular company. I think that, you know, pressure and suggestion and making other requirements, you know, short of actual, you know, laws and, you know, and quotas and policies, I think that actually gets a better reception, at least in this industry personally. And I think, you know, one thing I want to say, we shouldn't lose track of the fact that there is some progress, actually. I mean, I belong to an organization, the Houston chapter of Women's Corporate Directors. And in Houston, it's all energy. And there are many, members who are corporate directors who are just amazingly impressive women. And they're, very busy on boards. And, there is some change. But I guess I would be leery of actually imposing requirements.
So let me I want to weigh in here for a minute. I see some comments in the chat, and you're absolutely right. We all come to this either from academic perspective or finance practice, and we're not diverse. But on the other hand, there is this challenge that comes, I think, in today's world, where if you are a diverse person, say you're from an underrepresented group, and you've had some success in energy. We have some really talented people who have worked on the FERC, for example. You don't want to be invited just because you're an underrepresented person. You want to be invited because you were a FERC commissioner. And, I think the challenge we have is to really find people who have a really diverse perspective. So for example, there is a person who is from an underrepresented group who has a very senior role in a major pension fund in the United States. And Maria and I met with them, and they said that they didn't think that this was an investable space, that these gender investing impact funds were not going to be successful, and they could not make the justification for using their power as a pension fund to try to move the needle. And I guess I could have begged this person to come and be on the panel, and they would have provided a diverse perspective, which is that it's not investable and therefore there's nothing that can be done. But I don't even know, is that helpful just because they have a different ethnic background than me? When, I've worked with companies when I was at the UC to force them, I was part of a coalition of pension funds that forced people to put underrepresented minorities and others on their board as part of a proxy action. So, I do think that it is a very challenging space to find disagreement. And then when you have disagreement and you're going to be taped on Zoom and so forth, I will not share on what, but Ruth and I in the pre-call had a disagreement on a subject. And, we could air that all in front of you. And maybe that would make us seem more like CNN or some of the network news, but is that really appropriate for a university or for a webinar to just highlight differences among experts? I think the point is to have the points being made don't necessarily have to be different. They just have to be constructively educational. And I mean, I'm sure that we could come up with 5 things that none of us agree on. If you'd like me to make a statement that the other panelists won't agree on, I can, because I'm very infamous for that, especially in the oil and gas sector, which has had, had egregious practices in various times. Some companies not, but some companies, yes. I'll tell a story. I trained a young woman engineer when I was at Rice University, and she went in as a ESG environmental engineer. I won't say which company, to one of the large public companies. And they gave her an assignment to look at the safety measurements for an major offshore platform. And she called me at 6 o'clock in the morning, telling me she had an 8 a.m. meeting, and that the specifications were wrong, that the crawl space for a human being was too small, didn't meet government regulations. And I said, you have to be honest. I mean, that's what you're there for. So she went to the meeting, she made the presentation, she got reamed out by her boss for blindsiding everybody with the actual report of what had happened on this platform. There was a giant fight within this company about this problem. It looked like she called me to say, you need to move me to another company. I need some help. I have to leave this company. This is horrible. And I'll tell the true story. I called somebody in senior management at that company, even though she didn't give me permission to do that. And I said, what are you doing there? Like, you're saying all these things to the press that you've got all these things under control, and I bring you a top engineer. And how are you treating this person? Like, this is why you can't retain people. And the end of the story is her boss got fired. She was promoted. It continued to be unpleasant for her. And not only at that point was she not willing to move to another oil company, she wasn't even willing to be an engineer anymore. And she retrained to be a teacher. And this was a really gifted human being who traveled with me to Africa to work in development projects for water and energy and food. And she was lost to the industry. So it's really about, it's not even about, did I recruit the right number of people? To me, it's really about, that's why I made my statement about culture. It's really about what happens to you after you're in the company. And let me just say this last point, which I'm saying in public. I've never said this in public before. I have never had a job. I'm hoping Tufts will be the first one. I have never had a job throughout my entire career where someone hasn't called either the head of the company I work for, and that goes all the way back to Dow Jones, right? Or the president of the university, or someone on the board of the university, or someone senior at the university to have me removed because I said something or wrote something that someone didn't like. And I often wonder, had I been, if I had been an underrepresented minority, I think it would have been even worse. And I do think that had I not been a woman, people wouldn't have done that. I really do believe that. Maybe it would have happened anyway. But, it was a struggle. It's been a struggle, even for a person as visible as myself. So I tell those stories because we do seem just so similar because we're in a corporate setting on a Zoom and we're, trying to be tactful. And I think that that's really part of it. Some of these topics, don't lend themselves to tactful conversation.
Thank you for sharing your story, Amy. It's very refreshing. In the interest of time, I wanted to switch a little bit to the questions that have been piling in the Q&A box here, and I wanted to start with one from our friend at CGIP, Nobuo Tanaka, who's asking us, climate change is not gender neutral. Do you observe that gender balance and climate sustainability have positive correlations in business decisions? And, a different question is, can we connect the S and the E in ESG? Can solving for S make it easier for us to solve for the E? Can we solve the climate challenge if we have a more diverse perspective? And I'd love to maybe perhaps call Ruth to share her perspectives on that.
Well, it's interesting. Absolutely, I think diversity of thought into the industry would, advance the whole recognition of climate change as a problem. I can't say I've experienced that from a gender perspective as much as maybe from an international perspective. In other parts of the world, there's much more concern than there certainly is in Midland, Texas, about climate change. I've definitely had, very strong personal experiences on that front. But I do think that in general, companies that address the S are going to address the E. And these companies are going to be in the forefront. They're going to be innovative, and they will attract the best and the brightest. And, some of that unconscious bias might not be as traditional in a company that is striving to be different, to be forward looking. And so I do think that they are correlated. I can't say that I know specifically how you would measure that, but I do think they go hand in hand for sure.
Would anybody else like to chime in on this important issue around climate change? Vera, I see you unmuting yourself.
Yeah, I can certainly from a venture standpoint, I could say that I think that a lot of the firms that are focused on climate change view it as a very much a global problem and a social problem as well. And so, yes, I think that the lens with which a lot of climate focused investors are tackling this has a much kind of broader social element to it than a lot of your traditional, just kind of like tech investors take. I would also say, coming from a different angle at a question that was asked before, climate tech does require a lot of policy support. I know the policy question was centered more around, gender and other forms of diversity on boards, but just to have a slight detour here, I think engagement in the policy debate regarding climate change and particularly in the US, where this is significantly more controversial than it is in other places, we kind of have to have a level of engagement from a policy standpoint to try to level the playing fields for these new technologies. And I think that that's where you will start to, it's where certainly we have seen outsized returns in our portfolio when we talk about the fact that these diverse teams tend to outperform. I would say that's also driven by the fact that they are deeply engaged in I would say kind of a more holistic pursuit of trying to solve climate change, which involves both technology development, phenomenal teams, and also engagement on the policy front to drive markets for all of these new technologies. So I would just say, I think that the types of things we're talking about with regards to diversity within these organizations and diversity of viewpoints translates to strategy as well in a way that is incredibly important for tackling the climate problem.
Rita, is you being unmuted a sign that you'd like to chime in?
Sure. So I guess two broad points. The first one is it really gets to the nature of capitalism and capitalist progress, which is there are two conditions in which markets fail because the pricing mechanism doesn't work. And energy is definitely one of them. Diversity is another, because the cost, right, to the broad majority of people is very, very widely spread. So the individual cost to any one of us is relatively small, but the benefits are disproportionate to the people causing the harm, in this case, environmental degradation. And so what we know is you need some kind of policy adjustment to price fairly the impact. And Rebecca Henderson wrote a fabulous book called Reimagining Capitalism in a World on Fire, which really gets at this. And she said, let's say enough coal to power my PC for an hour costs 5 cents. And that's the only price the market recognizes. But if the cost to public health is another 5 cents and the cost of environmental degradation is another 5 cents, the true cost of that hour of power is just not represented. And capitalists systems respond to price mechanisms. So I think that's one that I do see, unless, as Vera was saying, unless you have something that makes the pricing more consistent with the outcomes you're trying to drive, left to its own devices, markets will do what markets do, just pursue the maximum profit that they can. I think the second point I'd like to make, it has to do with the nature of social movements and social change, and that's in some degrees we're talking about the environment. And there's a fabulous book which I just popped out to have a look at by Leslie Crutchfield called How Change Happens. She's a professor at Georgetown, and she studied successful and failed social movements and came up with some indicators of what seems to make the difference between the two, which I think is very germane to what we're talking about here. So the first issue that she talks about is mobilizing grassroots support, and that very often leaders focus too much on the policy and not enough on really bringing ordinary people along. And she cites the example of the success of the gun lobby as an example of this, that they've been incredibly successful at getting ordinary people to really identify with and buy into the ideals of that movement. And regardless of your opinion of whether that's a good thing or not, they've been very successful at doing that, whereas other kinds of social movements haven't done as well. Then she talks about building coalitions systematically, not trying to go for the whole solution, but sort of picking your targets. And she calls it the 10-10-10-20 rule. And she uses the example of how gay rights became, or the equality of marriage became actually legal in state after state after state. But they didn't try to, the leaders of that movement didn't try to do it all at once. They picked off each state and said, okay, well, if we can't go for full equalization in that state, let's just try to get harmful laws off the books, right? So let's take a piece of this puzzle. Then she talks about hearts and policy, and makes the point that for those of us of a certain age, I remember when you were able to smoke on airplanes and in doctors' offices. And in the course of a few decades, that behavior has almost completely changed. And one of the reasons is that the people who wanted to restrict tobacco utilization didn't just go for policy, they also went for emotion, and things like really funny cat videos, and stuff like that. So it was hearts and policy. Subsuming our differences to a larger goal. So learning to cope with adversarial allies was another point. Making a sharp break from business as usual. And here I think she uses an example that's very germane to our discussion, which is the case of acid rain. Back in the 70s, you would literally go outside and your eyes would sting because of massive amounts of pollution. And a remarkable coalition came together and said, we're not having this anymore. And it was bipartisan and broadly held, but it made a sharp break with the past. And I almost think we need to do something like that with climate. And then the point she makes is we need lots of leaders, and we need leaders at every level and every location. And I think her book's great. And I think what I particularly appreciated about it was she looks at social movements that didn't make it as well as those that did. And regardless of whether you agree with the goal, they have this systematic pattern of how they succeeded or not.
That's great. Thank you so much, Rita. That's a great answer. I do have a couple of quick questions I wanted to go through from the list here from the audience. If organizations are looking for diverse candidates, where do they look? Are there specialty headhunters in the space? And Amy responded about some of the early career recruitment at universities and colleges, but what about lateral hires? What about senior hires? Does Ruth or Cara have any perspective on specialty headhunters or ways to increase the pool of diverse candidates?
I can jump in and then turn it over to Cara. I'm actually in the middle of a board search right now, and at least at that level, I wouldn't say there are specialty headhunters because they're all focused on this. We interviewed 4 different headhunters, and all of them acknowledged that minorities and women are what boards are looking for right now. And they all touted various credentials and organizations that they've supported and people that they knew. And so I really do think it's very broad, at least at the board level, and which is a great sign. And it's not just new, but it has accelerated. And Amy, I just wanted to say, your mention earlier in the program about the NASDAQ requirements, I think that has, even though it's not been implemented, and basically for those who don't know, NASDAQ is saying you have to have 2 candidates, one a woman, and one a member of a underrepresented minority. And if you don't have that on your board, you have to explain why. And it's still in the proposal stage. It's being reviewed by the SEC, but I think that is having an impact, even though it's not even in yet. So anyway.
Yeah, I would echo that the NASDAQ proposal is definitely having an impact. We're seeing it just raising the awareness and the demand. I would say, I agree with you, Ruth, that there's no magic headhunter who knows where all the diverse professionals are. What we've found to be successful for us, certainly for the board element of this, is we do have partnerships with various organizations like Latino corporate directors who we reach out to and we work with, and that's been fruitful. Honestly, we've also been pretty systematic about having our people build out their own professional networks. And we keep that information around who do our trusted sources recommend. But again, and I can't remember whether it was Amy or Rita or Ruth, but the great comment about, this is about thinking about acting outside of your norm and building those relationships, really looking for them, and not for the purpose of hiring that person for a board or a role, but for the purpose of building out your own professional perspective and view. What we've seen though is that then allows us to have people that we know a little bit better before the recruiting process, either for a board or a role happens. And it facilitates and it speeds up, just like someone you have in your good old boy network speeds it up. Building that network intentionally helps speed up that process. But again, I think the key message here is intentionality is very, very said. You have to be thinking about it and make this not something that's off to the side, but a core of what you do. And so a lot of what we do internally at Carlisle is spend time really being clear on the why. Why are we doing this? And linking it to the biggest opportunities and challenges that we face, so that it is in the sort of stream of and part of what's critical for my role, rather than when I have a few moments, maybe I'll do this. And that's not easy. That's not easy.
So I want to inject kind of a frank comment, because I have personally, because I've been a professor, I have many students who were from different countries and different backgrounds across the United States, who were in my classes and work with me, and I help them get jobs, and I'm still in touch with them, 5, 10, 20 years later. And I have to say, I feel a little uncomfortable if somebody comes to me and says, we need a panelist and they have to be from group A or group B. I feel uncomfortable calling someone that I know who's from group A or group B if it's going to become clear that I need them because they're from group A or group B. And I think that makes it difficult. Before everybody was sensitized about this, there was no problem, because if they were just the best person, I would call them, right? And I didn't have to worry about would I hurt their feelings if I asked them to do something. We have different concerns today. For example, if you wanted to have someone moderate a panel and the panel wasn't diverse enough, but your moderator was diverse, is that a problem? If somebody asked me to moderate a panel of men, is that a problem for me to do that? So I do think that, in the recruiting process, I can tell you, I have the students who come and study with me, and they're from African countries. So they're not even having necessarily a Black American experience because they're from a foreign country. and they might have other problems because they're from that country, but and I can tell you, having launched these PhDs into the job market for those students that do not want to stay in academia, but want to go out to industry, I had a student, one of my top students ever in energy economics. Every other student of mine in energy economics that wanted to work in the oil and gas industry was hired, and this student was not hired. And in the end, I worked with her, found a job for her in the investment community. She did a great job there, and that led her now to be hired by the Canadian government as a good analyst. But the natural thing would have been to her to do what every other graduate student in that program did that wanted to go into energy industry. And I don't think it's a coincidence that she had more trouble landing a job than some of my other students.
Yeah, I think you bring up an excellent point, and that's, look, too much of recruiting often is based on gut feel. And it just pulls us back to some of the ideas that were raised earlier in the conversation about people feeling more comfortable and drawn to people who remind them of themselves. So part of this is how you find people. It's also how you manage that process through the interview and evaluation, and being, pretty rigorous and systematic about that, and really assessing objectively against the key competencies you need. And that sounds boring. It can sound robotic, but I can tell you it makes a difference if you can do that. It can mean ways in which you're ensuring that when you're doing a feedback session on candidates, you've got someone who's in the room who is objectively listening and making sure that that group is not going with gut feel, but going back to what is really important for this role and for this person. So I agree with you, Amy. It happens that too often, I think in the business community overall, the interview process is just not effective.
And let me make a point, because somebody in the chat asked a question about, green energy versus traditional energy. And there are a lot of women we can, like Ruth, that we can invite from both green energy and traditional energy. We have some very good women leaders. If we're talking about venture, Barb Berger from Chevron is an outstanding leader and has a very inclusive approach. But, what I would say is, I have also students who, of course, have gone into the clean energy space. And we have students who've done that from Columbia, from our program at Columbia, from SEPA. And a lot of them have had the same difficulties inside the green energy companies as I've had from my previous students when I was at Rice, who went into the oil and gas sector. And so I don't think it's unique. I think that in the end, to emphasize what Rita's saying and to emphasize what Kathy Phillips is saying, and it's just so, and I noticed that William had some great questions and comments in the Q&A, but really in the end, it's about culture. And so I know I have very limited time, but just quickly, our director, Julie Marina Carrera, and I went to do a program. We were meeting with a corporation that was deeply committed to diversity. And we had a meeting with their head of HR, some of the women in their leadership group, and the COO. And they were talking about the retention difficulty, and the traditional thing comes up. Everybody wants to point out to you that women have children and then leave the workforce. And so I mentioned this circumstance, which is that when I was raising my children, the hardest time of day for me was from 6:30 a.m. to 7:45, once I dropped the children off to school, and I was unusually lucky and was able to drop my own children off to school. Sometimes my husband dropped the kids off to school, but it would have been very difficult for me if I worked in an energy company where the daily meeting was at 7 a.m. And this company had all their leadership meetings at 7 a.m. And so we tried to explain that to the COO. And he said, no, they can't change that. They need a plan for the day. And I said, well, why don't you plan for the day at 4:30 p.m. the day before, when every woman in the company can make that 4:30 meeting. And then you'll be prepared when you come in at 7 a.m. to do what you decided at 4:30 p.m. And he had a lot of difficulty with that comment. So I just tell you, like, culture is really important, and it's not as easy to change as just saying it, because I said it, and I can tell you there's a very progressive CEO of that company, and they did not change their 7 a.m. meetings.
Actually, Amy, let me jump in there, because I think there's a little bit of a ray of hope post-COVID, because being able to be more flexible, working from home, it's becoming the norm with men as well as women. And it's a huge issue. And I'm actually very hopeful that that will be one thing that will help promote the inclusion aspect of what we're talking about. Because it's, you know, it's really across the board. It's not just women with children. And, you know, it's sad that that's the reason, but I'm at least somewhat hopeful that things will change slightly because of that.
Absolutely. And I have several companies that I've come across that have specifically made this a focus in terms of educating their managers around meeting times and the ability to be flexible, but also on the other side, not being afraid to ask a woman for an assignment at 5 o'clock and not giving her the chance to prove herself and potentially get promoted for fear that she might have to do dinner or take care of children. So it's a double-edged sword, but we're quickly running out of time. I think we've touched a lot of the questions, the great questions in the Q&A box, but I wanted to do a quick round on the advice that you have. We've talked about what companies can do better. Advice is women and diverse candidates in the audience. What is it that they can do better? Do you have any quick advice for them when it comes to entering and succeeding in the energy sector? And I will start with Ruth, who's the first one clockwise on my screen.
Well, I and a lot of women ask me about how you get on a board, you know, and I think the most important thing is really just to be very good at what you do. And if you really know your stuff, then you're confident, and it doesn't matter if you walk in and you're the only woman in the room. And I'll just leave it at that. That's what I tried to do in my career, and it worked for me.
Cara, any parting advice, and then we'll go to Vera.
I think it's really important to do your due diligence when you're looking at joining an organization. You know, look at what they're doing, who's doing what, who's in leadership. Learn what you can about the person you're going to be reporting to, because life is short and you're talented, and invest your time and your energy in the place where you're going to get the most out of it.
Vera?
I think cultivate some really great mentors that can help you do that due diligence, and also, you know, frankly, help you identify which doors are the right ones to walk through.
How about you, Rita? And then we'll close with Amy.
Sure. So briefly, there are two kinds of networks you can build. One kind of network is an execution network, get stuff done. You all trust each other. You can finish each other's sentences. The other kind of network is a more expansive entrepreneurial network, and that's where the opportunities are. Women systematically underinvest in entrepreneurial networks. They just prefer the other kind. And so I would say go out there and build those connections. That's how you break into these closed circles. It's by one person at a time.
That's great advice. Amy?
And speaking of networks, for those participants who are still left, or if you're watching this program on a webinar, please reach out to us at Columbia's Center on Global Energy Policy. We are looking to expand our network. We are looking to expand our network in energy and help promote and work with and be in our network people who don't look like us. So that's important. Could be male allies, could be people from a different background that that want to be involved in helping us broaden this program. And we will be back in touch with all of you. We're going to actually make more of an effort to globalize as well. So if you have a colleague in your network that's from another place, another country, or if you're listening or you're here from another country, you know, please join the network, encourage others to join the network. I look forward to future programs.
Excellent. Well, thank you, Julie, for putting some of the closing remarks in the chat box. I know we're way over time, but this was a fantastic conversation. Thank you to the participants. Thank you to the audience. Thank you for everything. Keep fighting the good fight, and I hope to see you all very soon.
Bye, everybody.
Bye-bye.